It's not services that make people happy. We can certainly make people unhappy. That's something that's within our power to do. But actually, the things that make people happy are like, who loves you, who cares about you, what's your vocation in life, do you have, things that make your life meaningful, So that's the stuff that actually makes people happy. And that kind of set me off on this trajectory of individualized living and kind of what I do all these years later. Housing is the hot topic around the place, and that's what everyone's focused on. But I always caution people, don't start with housing. Start with who is the person, what do they want, what do they need, what life do they want, and what would it take to do that?
Hi, I'm Dr. George Talaporis, and welcome to Reasonable Necessary, Australia's premier podcast series on the National Disability Insurance Scheme, brought to you by the Summer Foundation. I'm coming to you from the One2One and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. But before we go any further, please do me a favour and hit the like button, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and select the notification bell so you can be notified of future episodes. In this episode, I'm joined by Rod Davies, the CEO of One2One. We will deep dive into what it takes to set up an individualized living arrangement and explore why Western Australia is leading the country when it comes to individualized living. Check it out. Hey Rod, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Really good to have you on. I'm really interested in your journey. You started off as a support worker and now you're a CEO. Can you tell us about that journey and why you're so passionate about individualized living arrangements?
Yeah, sure. So, when I was a young person, I had a series of kind of powerful experiences for me that kind of led me to where I am. So, it started with high school, actually, if I'm honest. When was it? 27 years ago, thereabouts. And I went to a school where all the kids in the local area were included in our mainstream school. So it was there that I met a guy called Bill, who I'm friends with to this day. And Bill has cerebral palsy and an intellectual disability, and he can speak few words, But I got to know Bill through school. And I think when I was going to finish high school, I was going to go to uni and do IT or something like that, However, his mum rang me up and said, Rod, would you like to do support work with Bill? And I said, sure, what do I have to do? And she said something like, hang out with your friends, take Bill with you. And I thought I could do that. So that was the kind of pivotal moment, I guess. And I think going to an inclusive school kind of set the tone for a little bit about the work that I do, So I did support work with Bill. I worked at a range of places when I was a young guy. I worked at a recreation service where I drove a little white van, picked people up, did things. I worked in a group home for a bit. And then eventually I decided to go to the UK for a couple of years, have it like an adventure like many people do. So when I went to the UK, I landed a job as a co-resident, living with and supporting a man called Paul. And Paul had broken his neck, and so he had quadriplegia. And I guess in my mind, as a young guy at that stage, I'd really only seen people with disabilities either living with their family or living in congregate kind of arrangements. And that's what I sort of understood the world to be. But in meeting Paul, it opened my eyes. There's a whole other way that people with disabilities can live outside of those sorts of places. So it was a really kind of powerful experience for me as a young guy. And I lived with Paul for 2 years. The third part of that, though, Paul himself was an amazing person. He sadly passed away now. However, Paul undertook a master's research degree looking at quality of life study of people with disabilities in third world countries. So as his co-resident, I got to travel with Paul to Sri Lanka and to Tanzania. And I basically wheeled him around, which is not easy to do. and we interviewed many people with spinal injuries and basically asked them about their quality of life and how happy they were. And I guess it was in Sri Lanka in particular where I had this really kind of powerful epiphany, I suppose, in kind of wheeling Paul around, listening to these conversations. And this one person really sticks in my mind, this young guy that we met who had been, on the same foam mattress in a hut in the jungle for 10 years. So that's where he'd been for that long. He didn't even have a wheelchair, So on the face of it, you think, oh, this life must be really, really terrible, And certainly I'm sure he would do whatever he can do to have access to the things that we have, However, the ring thing that struck me is that man and many others like him rated their happiness much higher than the people who were much better off. And what dawned on me was that, what made him happy was the fact that he was part of his community. So even though he was in the hut, people would come and read the newspaper with him. They'd listen to the cricket on the radio, and he kind of knew what was going on in the village around him. The kids would come and see him. He was kind of part of it, even though objectively he had this pretty terrible situation in life. So the epiphany for me that I've taken, through the rest of my career is really it's not services that make people happy. We can certainly make people unhappy. That's something that's within our power to do. But actually, the things that make people happy are like, who loves you, who cares about you, what's your vocation in life, do you have, things that make your life meaningful, So that's the stuff that actually makes people happy. And that kind of set me off on this trajectory of individualized living and kind of what I do all these years later.
Well, a great story. Thank you for sharing that. I'm also thinking about your introduction to support work with Bill, where the mum said, hang out with your friends and, bring Bill with you. That was almost her saying, it's not about providing services, it's about him feeling part of a friendship group, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, for Bill, he's a really relational person. And, where we grew up outside of Perth, Bill was fully included in our society. And he has two wonderful sisters who really included him in their circle of friends. That's the stuff that makes his life meaningful, is being connected to people and having relationships, So I think, I didn't quite realize it when I was 17, 18, but his mum knew it. That was the stuff that made his life meaningful. And looking back, she made the right kinds of decisions for Bill.
And when we look at, all of the research and the information that's been gathered over the years about what makes for a good life, you're right. It's not about services. It's about belonging and community. And so now that you're the CEO of a disability service, can you explain how you then brought that to life in your service?
So we support 119 people now in individualized arrangements. And that's a whole spectrum of things, So that's some people who have small amounts of visiting support, and that's what it takes, right through to people who have, 24/7 support, to live in their own place. But one of the things that we really focus on is relationships and what people do with their life, And so that's different for every person, by the way. There's no magic formula to it other than really trying to build a relationship with the person and the network and understanding like who are they, what makes them tick, and trying to build in the things that they want to do into their life that make it meaningful, So for Bill, for example, he's a guy who is highly relational, like he when you meet him, he's always asking about people. He's always wondering, what are you going to do tomorrow? What am I doing tomorrow? It's this kind of conversation that we have. So for him, he's really well suited to a co-resident arrangement. So he's had a wonderful co-resident called Everett, who's lived with him now for, 13 years, something like that. He's been there a long time, and he's a really stable relationship in Bill's life, And if I could typify or explain it a little bit, it's a bit sort of, I don't know, like brother relationship. Now, sometimes maybe father-son kind of thing, I don't know, but they've got a really warm relationship, and they care about each other, So that kind of support arrangement kind of meets that need for Bill. But of course, for Bill, he also has a family. So, we actively set out for him to spend time with his sisters and his dad and other people in his life that are important to him. And me as his friend, obviously I work for One2One and One2One supports Bill. But Bill comes over for dinner at my house with my wife, every month, and we catch up and that sort of thing. So it's those sorts of activities that we try to build into people's lives, but it always looks different for every person because we're all different,
So I wanted to deeper into these arrangements. Can you maybe take us through how you support people to design and implement these quite individualized arrangements for their lives?
Yeah. So when we take people on, we generally undertake a process of service design. So it's a kind of deliberate process, and there's many ways you can do that, and you can do it any way you like, actually. But the way we do it is we use a method called optimal individual service design that was developed by Dr. Michael Kendrick. If people have come past him, he's a really interesting fella. So our method kind of looks something like this, if I can explain it. We have a series of interviews. Each takes about 2 hours, thereabouts, and we meet with the person with the disability and then 3 or 4 other people, who kind of know that person really well. So, we're talking mum, dad, brothers, friends, people like that who have a long-term relationship and really know the person, And the reason we do that too, is like, although the person's at the center, and many people can obviously speak for themselves or whatnot, but actually, like if you had to do a service design for me, there's things my wife knows about me that I don't realize, So if you talk to people who know the individual really well, you can kind of a 3-dimensional picture of who they are and their network and so on. So also, I should say, we're happy to talk to or listen or read OT reports and things like that. But to be honest with you, they don't really uncover who the person really is. Often there are a list of needs and, factors and things like that that are important to know about, but they don't really describe who the person is. So when we do these interviews, we talk through 21 domains of need. So the first one is usually pretty benign, and it's nutrition. It's to say, tell me about everything to do with food in your world. And so for some people that might be really critical, like let's say you have a PEG or you're on a special diet or there's some other thing where you have dysphagia. Nutrition has all these really life and death implications for people. But also, if you talk about nutrition, you'll discover a whole range of other things about people. So for example, I've got to have my coffee in the morning or I'm miserable, or on Sunday we go to mum's house and that's where we have dinner or lunch or whatever it is, So food is more than just nutrition, is actually a whole dimension of life and society and different things like that matter to people. So as we go down the list, there are a mixture of practical things like that, finances, safeguards, health, those sorts of things that you need to plan for and understand. But also we look at a range of kind of deeper sorts of things, One of the ones, the domains that I always kind of find interesting is life meaning. So we ask the question, what is it that makes this person's life meaningful? And no matter how significant the person's disability is, there is always something that the person or the people around them know about that person that makes that makes them tick, And that's the stuff that you're trying to draw out of the network, and you want to design into whatever the support arrangement is. So for example, for me, I get my life meaning from my family, from my kids, my wife, and so on. But also, I get life meaning from the work that I do. I pay my bills this way, but I really care about it. I genuinely care about what I do, and I want to feel like I'm making a difference to our society. So if I acquired a disability tomorrow, you'd need to, and you did a service design for me, you would need to explain how does Rod maintain a relationship with his kids and his family. And also, how do I do work that makes me feel like I'm contributing to society and so on? So when we have these interviews, we try to draw out these kinds of details, practical and deeper things about people. Then what we do is we go away and we have an analysis phase where we look at, like, what did everyone have to say, And where people, say things in common, we look for those things. Like, so Rod must have a relationship with his family, Okay, great. You've got to explain how we're going to do that. Equally, though, we look for things that people disagree about. Because you can imagine, often we do this and you'll find that mum and dad think one thing, their son thinks a different thing. Sometimes mum and dad disagree about things. So what you're seeking to do is understand, what are the points of disagreement in this person's life and in their network, Because if you don't address it straight up, the moment that thing happens, the wheels fall off and people start arguing and fighting and we sort of get caught in the middle, So once we've got that out, then what we would do is we start to develop an initial pitch about, like, how do we think we could best support this person? And if I'm honest with you, George, 80% of it is actually what comes from the people that we've spoken to, because people with disabilities and their families usually know the best way to meet the needs of that person, So often we're kind of reflecting back to them, service design, but with those bits and pieces about how those things best occur, I guess what we do, though, is overlay, all sorts of other system type things, such as industrial relations and NDIS and other things like that you have to take into consideration when developing a service design. So once we've got the initial idea, we put it to people, and normally we get it, like I say, 80% right, I guess. But there's always some stuff in there that people disagree with. They go, you haven't really understood that, or, I'm not sure about that. So what we're doing there is we're clarifying and sort of getting clear about how we're going to do this together, But at the end of it, we usually arrive upon an agreed way of supporting the person in an individualized living arrangement, and we then write it up, And we have and I guess what that forms is a bit of an agreement between us, the person, their network, about how are we going to do this together, about what's organization business, what's family business, who's going to do what, and all the other moving parts. And that sort of becomes the launching point for the person's individualized living arrangement. After which it usually changes and adapts, actually, if I'm honest. Sometimes we spend a lot of time doing the service design, and then 6 months later it's different, which is wonderful because it means that we tried something, it didn't quite work, so we're now trying something a bit different, and it kind of changes and evolves over time.
That is so interesting. It feels a bit like going to see a therapist, really. You're like, trying to understand what makes the person feel alive or feel like their life has purpose and meaning. Which isn't really what we often talk about in the disability service world, is it? It's very, very focused on what that person, or who that person is, rather than just what their support needs are. I really like that.
So much of our disability service system really is focused on, showering and toileting and behaviour and all those things, which are important. They are, However, if you're not thinking about what life does this person have, then they're going to be miserable, And if they're miserable, they'll make it not work, So, and also, if they're miserable, why are we even doing this in the first place, So you have to start there, and in terms of what's going to make this person's life meaningful, and build those things into the arrangement. And often they're things, can I say, that don't cost money. Like going back to our little anecdote before about Sri Lanka, the things that makes people's lives, and having done this a long time, the things that make people's lives meaningful are usually not services. They're relationships, they're connections, they're feeling included. It's having a vocation in life, about a job or something like that. It's really meaningful. They're the things that that you need to build into the arrangement, and generally they don't cost much, if anything.
Oh, absolutely. The best things in life are free, aren't they? As they say. As you were talking, I was thinking back to my NDIS planning meeting, and my goodness, it was nothing like what you're talking about. It was all about how many hours of this do you need, and how many bits of this, and all very numbersy and not much about me as a person. And what you're doing is very different, and it sort of goes back to what we were really talking about when the NDIS was set up, and that was around people's goals and aspirations. Feels like that's sort of fallen away, unfortunately.
The NDIA does funding. They don't really do planning, because planning is really complex, relational, ongoing kind of thing, So if you have a 30-minute time slot with a planner, really it's funding that they're doing. And I think some of the reforms that the government are looking at is really kind of acknowledging that, So planning, I think, is something that happens outside of a funding kind of conversation. And that can happen lots of different ways, by the way. I mean, we're a service provider, so we take that kind of, it's our kind of role, I guess, is what we see it to be. However, many people self-manage, and they can other people can be involved in that and help them do that. Support coordinators and other organisations and other people who kind of focus on that. So in my opinion, the NDIA is really a funding mechanism. It's not so much of a planning mechanism. If I was honest.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about is what planning really is about, and what the NDIA does is more around assessments and working out what's reasonable and necessary, and then allocating a budget for you that you can then hopefully use to have a good life. I'd like to hear a bit more about some real life examples of where you've been able to achieve that for people.
Another family, though, who gave me permission to share their story is a lady called Jessica. And Jessica's a woman in her 50s, and she has an acquired brain injury from a car accident when she was a young woman. And so the important thing to know about Jessica, one of the many important things to know about her, is that she is really, really religious, And so for her, like, religion is something that's really deep in her fibre. And I'm sure she won't mind me saying, but she's a Jehovah's Witness, right? So she's very devout as a person. And that means all sorts of things for her, you know. She actually has a wide network of people in her community that she visits, and she talks about, you know, Jesus and the Bible and different things, and that gives her life meaning, you know. So many years ago, you know, her family were thinking about the future for her, and she has quite significant support needs, you know. And they looked at group homes, and they felt, look, if she was to move into a group home, it would be hard to accommodate her spiritual and religious beliefs, you know. So she really needs a kind of a tailored kind of arrangement. So we went through this design process with her and her network and her family, and what we came up with was also kind of a co-resident arrangement where she has somebody that she's recruited through her church, so she shares her faith, you know, so they have the same kind of, they're on the same wavelength, you know, about many things, and she lives with her and supports her in her own home. But in addition, there are support workers who come in like 8 hours a day, and they give the co-resident a break. But also they help her do many of the things. They take her to church, and they do many other things that help meet those needs for her. The other key thing for Jessica is that she has a son, you know, and so he is, you know, a central relationship for her that she wishes to maintain, and he lives in a different state. So it might sound really simple, but one of the things that folks do is every week they have a scheduled time where she uses FaceTime, you know, through her iPad and talks to her son and has a relationship, you know. And so I don't know, that kind of gives you a bit of a flavour of that kind of arrangement. Actually, the other interesting thing for her particular scenario is that her brother-in-law and her sister are highly involved in the arrangement, and they really drive the arrangement in terms of how staff are engaged and what they do, and they're really hands-on. So I suppose, you know, it's a kind of a partnership with One2One that we have with Jessica and her family to help her live in her own home.
Yeah, I heard a few things there. You've talked about the fact that she had a co-resident,
Yes.
and then she had support workers. And it sounds like what you offer through your individualized living arrangements is a few different ways of achieving the support and the belongingness or the sense of community that person needs. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's many ways to do it. I suppose one of the things that I would sort of caution a little bit is not falling into the trap of thinking about models of individualized living. You know, there are definitely models of individualized living. The Summer Foundation has highlighted some of these recently around, say, host arrangements and home share arrangements and other things. I guess to add to that would be a co-resident arrangement, you know, where people that are paid a salary and they live with the person with a disability in their own home, you know, that kind of thing.
Can I just ask, for people who are wondering, what's the difference between a co-resident and a support worker?
Yeah, well, a co-resident shares their life with the person, you know. So you're there is a role, you know. So there are things that they need to do, for which you need to be very specific, and here are the requirements. So it's a role, it's a job, you know. However, also people tend to share their life together, you know. So for example, I was a co-resident with Paul, and I was in the UK, but we travelled around Europe. We got in a car, we drove around. You know, we went to the pub together. You know, we had friends over, we had dinner parties. It was kind of like a sharing of your life, and that's sort of, I guess, the ethos of being a co-resident. So it's a role, but it's not like working in a group home where, you know, you're one worker on a 8-hour shift and you've got 3 or 6 people you got to look after. It's a different kind of arrangement that it brings about. It's a sharing of lives, you know. So I should point out some co-residents are full-time. There's other arrangements where they're kind of more respite in nature, I guess, where you might have a few co-residents that split the role up a little bit, but nonetheless it's more about, you know, bringing a bit of yourself to the role and sharing your life with that person. That kind of makes sense.
Does it get complicated sometimes? Because in this sector, we often talk about, professionalization and, personal boundaries and, the person's at work and another, a friend. It sounds like the co-resident is a bit of both, and does that lead to some challenges sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely it does. You know, I mean, if you live with someone, the line between your personal life and your work life evaporates, you know, so it's a blurring of it. In fact, you've got to walk straight over that and kind of embrace it. And actually, you know, for most of those arrangements, the people have really strong, long-going relationships, so they're pretty solid in it. You know, it's really other people that sometimes get caught up in it. And I suppose, you know, that can play out a million different ways in these kinds of live-in sort of arrangements. But one of the common things I would see, you know, is that you might have a support worker who, you know, who goes to the co-resident's house, you know, with the person with a disability, and they're there for a few hours, you know. So they make all sorts of judgments about that person, you know, the windowsill's dusty or whatnot, you know. And so, you know, what sometimes we say to support workers is like, you've got to have a level of understanding, you know. Imagine if people were coming to your house and having, you know, and had a window into your life. So we ask people to be forgiving, but part of the role, I guess, we would see for ourselves is to help navigate the kind of issues that pop up in the relationships between, you know, people with disabilities, their families, and the live-in type supports, including hosts and you know, all sorts of other people. And it's more of an art form than it's a science often, you know, in the way that you have to deal with these things.
And is that part of your job as, you know, the facilitator, that you help people with when things can get awkward or messy? Is that where you come in?
Yes, yeah, yes, often. I mean, sometimes families sort it out between themselves, and they say, "Look, you know, I'm not happy about this." And actually, you know, my impression has been often that where there's an issue, it's best to go directly to that person and talk to them openly about it. You know, so sometimes that's what we encourage families to do. So, look, speak with the person about what your concerns are. But sometimes, you know, they need us to do that, or we do that, or we facilitate that. So it's like I say, it's kind of, there's not really like a rule book to it. It's just you follow your intuition and your gut instinct about things. I mean, certainly, you know, if there's abuse or neglect or anything like that, then we have to deal with that straight away, you know. Unfortunately, though, we haven't, honestly, in all my life of doing this, there hasn't been any major scandals that we've come across, you know. But inevitably, you know, if you've got people, you know, sharing lives together, there's all sorts of frictions and tensions and things that occur for people, and it's kind of par for the course, actually, you know. And actually, I've got to say, you know, with going back to, you know, ways of supporting people to live in their own home, you know, in some jurisdictions, say, like the United States, I would say, to some extent, you know, what's happened is they've conflated individualized living with live-in support, you know, and especially host arrangements. So in some places that I've seen, you know, if you don't want to live in a group home, then the kind of host family is the option you have, you know. And actually, I've got to say, living with people is not ideal. Like for me personally, if I acquired a disability, I wouldn't be suited to a live-in arrangement because I like my own space. What would suit me actually is an arrangement where I had people with me when I need them, but not there when I don't need them. You know what I mean? So it's important not to kind of fall into the trap of, you know, pursuing one model of support of individualized living as the way forward, because actually what you need to do is have the approach of individualized services, of really understanding who is this person and designing each arrangement uniquely around that one individual, you know. And that could be co-resident, it could be a whole range of things, but don't start with the model, if that makes sense, you know.
I really like that. I always think back to the, you know, that person by person approach that you just work out what is it that will work for that person and go from there. I'm also keen to understand you're from Western Australia, where there's a lot more of these arrangements, I understand, than in other states. Can you help us to understand how this has happened and why WA is the leader in this space?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not really entirely sure why. As I understand it, it really started many, many years ago, before I was born, actually, in family leadership. So that is, I think in the 1950s even, there was many families who got together and said, you know what, we don't want our son and daughter living in institution. And that kind of movement, you know, gathered pace over the decades, you know. And unfortunately, we were lucky. We had a bureaucracy at the state level before the NDIS that was also really on board with that in terms of people with disabilities being included and deinstitutionalisation as our purpose, you know, is what we're here to do. And the state government, you know, to their credit, both sides of politics here actually for many years were really supportive of the agenda of closing institutions and trying to help people with disabilities live in their own home. So now around that, many providers popped up to kind of meet that need and that demand, I suppose, including One2One. And so what we created was kind of an ecosystem where, everyone was swimming in the same direction as, in terms of individualized living and so on. There was a range of different sort of policies and kind of structures that the government kind of put in place that supported that. So for example, local area coordination was developed in Western Australia to begin with, and it was quite different before the NDIS to the version of it that exists now. But that really pushed the envelope and really helped people in local areas think about, over a long period of time, about, how could I live in my own home rather than a group home or a hostel or an institution, They also, we had inclusive education, If you go to an inclusive school, I think you're much more likely when you're an adult to want to live in your own home rather than live in a group home because you've had this experience of being included, Industrial relations, the state government created provisions that allowed flexibility in the way that families could engage staff and so on. Actually, the other unsung hero, can I point out, is the Department for Housing in WA. Was really supportive and did really good work around helping people with disabilities secure their own homes rather than just procure, building group homes and other those sorts of kind of bricks and mortar type places. So all those sorts of things kind of came together to kind of create a groundswell where I think it was in 2011. More people were choosing an individualized living arrangement as compared to a group home, which is we're really quite proud of that moment, Actually, one last thing is there was a real investment in the thinking of people in our community. So not just providers and bureaucrats and people like that around individualized living and how can you do this and how do you go about it, but also in people with disabilities and their families. And what that looked like really on the ground was, when I was a young guy, I was in LAC for many years. And so, there was a steady stream of workshops and visitors from overseas that came to Perth that the government sort of hosted to run workshops for families and people to kind of think about and explore values and planning and all these sorts of things. And it, that over decades really built that kind of ecosystem that enabled individualized living to sort of flourish here.
And then the NDI decided that they wanted to see more of this around the whole country. And they brought in something called ILO, or Individualized Living Options. Has that made it easier for people to do this kind of thing?
Well, yes and no. I think it was great that they had this initiative and they tried to bring the focus back to it. And certainly, we were a contributor to the development of ILO and we really appreciated it. One of the downsides, there's two downsides to ILO, though, I would say. ILO funding has not been indexed in years now. And of course, people, inflation has taken off. And so basically, ILO funding has become completely unsustainable for people's support arrangements because wages and costs and everything else have gone up and the funding hasn't kept pace with it, So that was a real, they shot themselves in the foot, around that. The other thing too, though, can I say, is compared to, say, SIL funding and other things, we discovered that it just required less bureaucracy, to be honest, in terms of SIL. With ILO, you'd have to develop a service proposal and all those sorts of things, which we were happy to do, but it just felt a little bit like, people, there were lots of hurdles were put in the way of people getting on and kind of living their life,
Are you saying that the government made it really bureaucratic? Really? That doesn't happen, does it?
Yeah, look, yes, they did. I don't want to be critical of them. They've got a hard job to do, so I feel for them. But yes, they could have done better on the ILO space, for sure.
Moving forward, what trends do you see, or what do you have to see for the future for individualized living?
Yeah, well, look, I think there's kind of there's two forces at work, I think, in our disability space, On the one hand, the government is, I guess, trying to rein in cost of the NDIS, right? And if you think about, like, historically, what has that meant for human service systems all over the place in Australia, And what it's meant really is that we've institutionalized people. That is that you group people with disabilities together, you have one worker, and you kind of gain that efficiency, So the talk of 1 to 3 SIL as being the expectation of people with disabilities in a country saddens me, and that's the risk I would see in a certain way. On the other hand, though, diametrically opposed to that, there's a groundswell of people with disabilities and their families who are aware that the congregation segregation of people with disabilities is harmful. And if there's any doubt, we just spent $500-600 million on a royal commission And that's the punchline. The punchline is that, you know, these places are not benign, they're suboptimal, and they can be harmful to people. So, you know, on the one hand, I guess you've got a government's trying to save money, and on the other direction, you've got you know, people with disabilities and who don't want to be institutionalized, you know. Now, the good news is that individualized living arrangements have operated for years under the same framework as group homes. It's just really how you use the funds and how you kind of partner with families and other people to help people live in their own homes. So there's a massive opportunity here to help people with disabilities have better lives and also operate sustainably within the NDIS.
Do you have any advice before we go, Rod, for individuals and families that might be considering something like what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I would say if you're thinking about the future of yourself or your family member, you know, certainly I would urge you to consider an individualized living arrangement or that kind of approach. You know, what do you got to lose? You know, it definitely is worth investigating, and I think you've got everything to gain actually if you go down that path. You know, I'm a big advocate for it, of course. So you know, so I would say so start that process early. You know, in terms of, you know, so if you wait until, you know, the person's in their 50s, that's a much harder kind of process to go through than if you start thinking about it early on and planning for it. Because these are long-term decisions often for people, you know. Actually, here's another thing, you know, when people ring me up, often what they're focused on at the moment is housing. Housing is the hot topic around the place, and that's what everyone's focused on. But I always caution people, don't start with housing. Start with who is the person, what do they want, what do they need, what life do they want, and what would it take to do that? So if you start in that kind of thinking about that space, the type of housing you need and where the housing has to be and that kind of thing, that falls out of that kind of thinking process, you know, thought process, if that makes sense. So don't start with housing initially as what the focus should be. Lastly, I would say, you know, if you're interested in this sort of thing, try and find you know, organisations that you can sort of connect with and people who are in this space. And sadly, I mean, there are less you know, peak bodies and groups to kind of provide information to people with disabilities about individualised living than there used to be. You know, like WA Individualised Services sadly closed recently, you know, because you know, there was not the funds to kind of keep these kinds of places going for our system, which is a real shame, you know.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rod, for coming on the show. It's been really helpful to hear from you about your life and how you've supported people to live a good life. And I hope that people feel inspired to do something similar for themselves.
You're welcome. I hope it was useful.
Thanks, Rod. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
That's all we have time for on today's episode of Reasonable and Necessary. As you know, we love your feedback, so please share your thoughts or questions in the comment section below. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay well and reasonable.